Okay, this is the first formal lecture for the class, and this one covers what an organization is and the legal components of an organization. So for this particular module, there are a couple of parts. This is part A, which again looks over that component of the legal component, the definition. All right, so what is an organization? Well, largely we will find out right now. Organizations are defined as a group of people intentionally organized to accomplish an overall common set of goals. In other words, it's a group of people that get together with a common purpose to achieve some end. So before you ask yourself, before we go any further, ask yourself why organizations? What do they do for us? So let's take a look at the next few slides here. Well, one thing they do is to understand what groups are. Groups are two or more individuals that jointly characterized by a network of relevant communications, collective identity, and shared goals with associated normative strengths. What do they do for us? Well, they help us accomplish tasks. It's a whole lot easier for a group of people to do something than for a single person to do it. Think about trying to get across a river. If you can swim, more power to you. Most people can't. Most people depend on a boat or a bridge. It's a whole lot easier, and for some of us, absolutely imperative that we work with a group of people to build that bridge or build that boat. Trying to do it by ourselves is virtually impossible. They connect us. People like to be parts of groups and organizations. They give us some sense of identity. They give us emotional support. They validate us, and they help us meet our needs. We get money if we work. But you'll notice that in many studies that have looked at organizations, they found that the most important part of being a part of a group or organization isn't necessarily the money. It's the fact that it does give us a connection, some connection to the outside world. So groups and organizations are critical for us to be a part of. So to understand an organization, a very simple idea. To accomplish any task is easier with numbers. How about building a bridge? We mentioned that. How about eliminating hunger? It'd be difficult to do those things alone, but it's a whole lot easier when you work with groups of people to do it. From a social work perspective, organizations serve as the mediating system between a person and the fulfillment of need. Organizations help us achieve a variety of needs that our clients might have difficulty with. And as such, we can think about why we use organizations so ubiquitously, why we develop policies and programs that use organizations as their primary tool. So when you think about the relationship between a policy, a program, and an organization, organizations implement the policies created elsewhere, but they actually also create policy as well. Congress is an organization. The agency that you work with, it creates policy too. Simple things like dress codes or who can use the services of that organization. So both of these components, implementation and creation of policy, depend upon organizations. Now, traditionally, organizations have been broken into two very large categories. Formal or legitimated, which means they've been legally defined, legally classified, they're legally authorized, if you will. Examples might be a bank or a church or a homeless shelter. And then there are also what we call informal organizations. People come together, but not with any legal basis. So you might have a neighborhood loan shark, got a few people working for them. It's an organization, but it's not legal. A group of meditators that get together and get together after work to meditate. Or suppose you and a few friends get together to hand out sandwiches to hungry persons. You do it voluntarily. It doesn't have a legal basis. So you can think about an organization as being formal, again, which means legitimated or legally classified, or informal, non-legitimated, non-classified. Most everything we're going to talk about in this class speaks to the idea of the formal organization. Now, formal organizations have four components. The first of these, the definition or legal, which we call the auspice, its mission and goals, the rules and policies, the bylaws, the strategic plan. So these are things that define what the organization does in a legal sense. Structure, the parts. All organizations have parts. You can think about quick examples such as the hierarchy in an organization. You have directors, you have supervisors, you have line workers. They all have some kind of processes. The most important of these are communication, how information travels in that organization, and authority. Who has the power to affect the decisions of others? And then there's the organizational environment. Organizations exist in context. They do not exist by themselves. So to understand an organization, you've got to understand these four parts. What are its legal components? What are its structural components? What are the processes? And what are the organizational environment's characteristics? So in this lecture, we're going to sort of talk about the first of these, and then in the subsequent lecture, we'll pick up a few more as we go. So let's start with the definition and legal components of the organization. Most important of these is what we call auspice. Auspice is the legal basis of the organization. I'll give you some details about that as we go. But generally, understand that any formal organization has to have a legal recognition of some type. In our society, that usually comes from something like the IRS or state government will recognize formal organizations. The organization applies for and receives an auspice, its legal basis. Organizations have visions, missions, and goals. These, believe it or not, are legal components of the organization that help to define who they are. And then organizations also have rules and policies. So we will cover all these in some detail in the next slide, next lecture, so you can begin to understand a little bit about these things. Let's start with the concept of auspice. Auspice is a term for classifying the legal and support basis of an organization. There are many types of auspice, which we'll describe on the following pages. But below, you get the pretty good idea of what the main types of auspice are. There are governmental auspice, which means that they've been created by law and are funded by government, usually through taxes. So, for an example, Congress has a governmental auspice. The Department of State has a governmental auspice. Most of what we work for, however, fall into either the for-profit or non-profit auspice. For-profit means that the organization is private, it has owners, and exists largely to make money. Non-profit or not-for-profit, the terms are essentially the same. There's some minor funding differences. They're essentially the same. Exist for the benefit of providing some service. Who decides on the type of auspice? You and the government. And I'll explain that as we go along here. But to understand this, you want to look at who created the organization, the goals of the organization, and how it is funded. Governmental auspice. The organization was created by law or by some executive action. There are federal, state, and local organizations. Some of you work, for instance, for county or state children youth services. That has a governmental auspice. Some of you may work for the Veterans Administration, VA. That has a federal auspice. It's created by public law. Some of you may work for the county, local auspice, created by the county and its legal authority. Here are some examples. Governments and departments, federal agencies, quasi-governmental agencies. You can take a look at a long list if you go to this website. Here are some examples of cabinet positions. Now, what is most important to most of us is this nonprofit versus profit auspice. Both types of organizations are generally private sector, meaning they're not government. They don't have a government auspice. But to become a nonprofit organization, the organization must apply for and receive governmental approval. For-profits might seek governmental approval, and doing so has some important benefits, largely taxes, but not 100% necessary. Now, where this gets a little bit confusing is that both for-profit and nonprofit can make profit, meaning they have surplus funds. But there are important differences with who owns the organization and what can be done with the extra funds. We'll get to that in a few minutes. Organizational goals are often, but not always, different. Generally, philanthropic and educational agencies have traditionally been nonprofit, but that's been changing a little bit. Church is almost always nonprofit. Most social services traditionally have been nonprofit, benevolent organizations. But again, there are some things you'll see from time to time that differ. This slide helps you think a little bit about the differences. For-profit has its goals, high returns, money profit. For nonprofit, the goal is to help. So auspice, for-profit, goals are generally to maximize profit and income. Most are businesses. But the important point is they have identifiable owners. Stock, they could be partnerships, one person owns it, and organizations that can own another. Organizations, by the way, have the same rights as persons under the law. You might have heard a lot about Citizens United. Very important stuff. But the point is that for a for-profit, there is an owner, an identifiable owner. Nonprofit, on the other hand, have as their goals usually not making money, but some public service. Traditionally, again, most social service and educational organizations have been nonprofit, but in recent years, we've seen the rise of for-profit hospitals, we've seen the rise of for-profit schools with some fairly serious and I would say negative consequences, but that's another lecture. So, here's your formal definition of the nonprofit. From a tax and regulatory definition, it enjoys special tax status, enjoys non-distribution constraint, which means you can make profit, but you can't distribute it. It has to be kept in the company, in the organization, and it has no owners. A nonprofit exists in trust for the public good. Functionally, performs public goods, public tasks. And it technically can exist for some educational or issue purpose as well. Main points, however, it cannot be done for the purpose of making a profit. It cannot be commercially motivated, and the organization may not distribute any net earnings profits to individuals with control, such as members, officers, directors, trustees. It can pay them for their service rendered, but it can't give profit to them. It's formed for the purpose of serving a public or mutual benefit. Here's some nonprofit synonyms you might take a look at. Here are the main differences between the for and nonprofit organization. For the for-profit, typically economic, it has owners, its profits belong to the owners, and its profits are taxable. For the nonprofit, typically philanthropic, there are no owners, it's held in the trust for public good, and everything that it does is basically tax-free. Now, for your capacity assessment, you need to define the auspice of the organization. The easiest way to find out is to ask somebody, are we a for-profit or nonprofit organization? If it's for-profit, that means it's been recognized by the IRS and the state in which it's located as a nonprofit organization. For-profits do not have to reach that hurdle. This concludes lecture part A.